Hello, welcome to Philosophy Roulette number 144. I've gotten 12 by 12, a whole gross of these things. So, where we read philosophy and review it live for the viewing audience. And if you have anything you'd like me to read, as long as it's on the shorter end of papers, I'd love to do it. Just send it along, because I probably haven't read it, and that's the only criterion I have for this whole project, is that I just don't know what I'm getting. That's why it's roulette. And even then, I probably would make exceptions. So it's more like guidelines than a strict rule. So let's see. I just grabbed the analysis paper from this morning because I know analysis papers are short, and it was good. It was There Are No Fundamental Facts by Roberto Loss. That was good. Argumentation. I liked some of the argumentation ones from the other day, so let's take a look at this one. See how long it is. And see if it's available. 1 to 27. That's not going to happen right now. That would take 3 hours. Okay. Yeah, so 1 to 27, 1 to 39, oh dear. 1 to 5? Whataboutism is inconsistency? 1 to 15, okay. Sorry, the random spacing sometimes gets my little script to tell me how long things are. Yeah. Let's see, anything else besides what I've looked at already? Introductions, rhetoricians, and argumentation. This is a good question. Why is it rhetoricians or just not rhetors? I think it's just rhetors, not rhetoricians. Well. Rhetorical scholars. Alright. Special issue on argumentation. The rhetorical approach. Okay, so that's interesting. Argument, comments on Goodman. 1 to 15, that's what I just looked at. Rhetorical structures. Okay, maybe I'll come back to these argumentation at some other point, but right now it looks like it's mostly stuff I've looked at, or at least I tried to get a hold of, and it was on the longer side. Enzymes. Well, that's German. I can't read German. Okay, Erasmus' Journal of Philosophy and Economics. On the offside that ergo has something that's short enough, I'll take a look at it. It's unlikely it does. Feminism without metaphysics or... Well, let's see if Urquetness has anything. Sometimes they have short stuff too. So, Hegel Bulletin. I used to not understand anything about Hegel. Then one day I said, oh my god, Hegel's starting to make sense. I must be losing it, or something's happened to me. And I was just like, oh boy. That's when Hegel starts making sense. It was an old joke when I took classes when I was an undergrad on the principle that I'm an undergrad and stupid and don't know what I should be taking, so I took stuff I didn't know what it was. I took Hegel. At one point in the semester, someone asked the professor, who was actually a very good Hegel scholar, who's a well-known person, if he could explain something better. And it was some obscure thing, something arcane. And the teacher just, he stops, he thinks for a bit, he walks around the room for a second, and he goes, look, old joke, but it makes sense. It says, the day before Hegel died, two men understood Hegel and God. Then Hegel died. And that was his, the best he could say about, explaining Hegel more. I guess it was a hard question. I don't know if Erasmus is open access. Is it? Let's find out. Let's just see if this is available. I can't remember. Oh, look at that. It's there. Agency and choice. Oh, no. But, I mean, the problem is with something like that, it might be all numbers, and I can't read essays full of numbers. Oh, no. Look at this. Or is this just a... Okay, this is a PhD thesis somewhere. I was like, why is this so short? That's amazing. I was very impressed. I was like, how is that the case? Alright. Okay, so let's see. There's a review. Let's see what else we have. U.S. economics and for scientific authority. Understanding with models. So these are kind of interesting. Maybe let's see if I can click on this one. See what 1 to 4. Oh, okay, so this is what this was. A whole bunch of PhD theses got summarized. That's why they're particularly short. Otherwise, everything else is a bit long. Okay, that's kind of nice. Oh, I've looked at Hegel Bulletin. It's more of a bulletin than a journal. Like, it has journal articles, but it also has, like, things that would be of interest to Hegel scholars, like Hegel scholar meetings. Let's see. Alright, so this is, 11 pages? Dialectics and difference. Negative dialectics as a logic of action. So, do I have access to this? I just somewhat doubt it at this point. Oh, that's too bad. That looked like it might have been a little bit of fun. Different ways of facing Hegel's system as an impossible attempt to harmonize traditional and openness to novelty. Shucks. Oh well. Would have been nice. Let's see what else we have here under Hegel stuff. Review. As I always say, please send me stuff to read, otherwise I'm stuck in roulette is what I am. Okay. Doing and allowing in the context of physician-assisted suicide. Okay, so that's 13 pages. Maybe we'll take a look there. Preface to the issue. ISR is still a digital ontology. So this is informational structural realism. That's always fun stuff. You're talking about computers and knowledge and structures. Alright. Oh, this is like particularly short. This is like 7 pages. Let's take a look at that one too. Did I clicky? Yeah, there we go. Alright. The concept of difference equations and model reconstruction. Okay, and this is, I read this paper, so below here must have been older stuff that I've already taken a look at. Download PDF. Is this open access? It might be. Okay, so that's cool. So let's try. Alright, so that's a definite possibility. 14 pages. And teeny little font. Alright, so let's go see what else we have. Okay, not there. Nope. Okay, not getting read in that case if it's not available. And this is the one that was particularly short. I always like the short papers. It makes my life a little simpler. 1 to 12. Okay. 1 to 12 and double spaced. You win. Although there is some logic stuff here. Let's see how bad it is, because I just can't handle reading out a ton of formulas. I mean, we've got... Alright, so it'll be this one, between this one and this one. And who has more formulas? Alright, because this one is just... it's not that bad. Okay, so what do I want to do? It's going to be a coin flip then. So, self-imitation, infallibility, and hydro evidence, that will be heads. And the doing, whatever this one is, doing and allowing will be tails. This is a good old standard US coin, and you get to look before I do. Oh, that's a tails. Okay. So, which one did I... Well, it would help if I remembered which one it was that I said which was which. But I think this was tails, this one right here. Okay, so... You know, it's funny, I emailed the authors and I said, hey, look, I did a review. If you want to check it out, that's cool. You know, like, I mean, look, that's the extent of the emails. Because like, then I give like some stuff about the websites. And they're all like, oh, it's so flattering. Then they realize it really is like roulette. And they're like, okay, well, you didn't actually like my work until you found it. I'm like, yeah, I didn't say I liked your work. I just said I reviewed it. And they're like, oh, it's just by chance. I'm like, yep. It's like, reviews aren't necessarily flattering either. It's just sort of funny that, like, a bunch of people think, like, just because I happened to read their paper, it's because I liked it. How would I know I liked it before I read your paper? Okay, if you want to get a link to this, it's going to be in the chat. You type in !paper, and it's going to be in the show notes below if you're watching this later on the YouTubes. It is actually the most common thing is like everyone's like, that's cool. I appreciate you reading my work. That's the number one comment. The second most comment is, well, it's basically a tie between I'm shocked. It's really weird hearing someone else read my paper, and two, I'm really happy that I know at least one person now read my paper. So those are the normal reactions I get from the authors. Okie dokie. Doing and allowing in the context of physician-assisted suicide. So we got some biomedical maybe this is metaphysics of biomedical stuff or whatever. A controversy in medical ethics and medical law. Assistance in active versus passive rational suicide. For decades, there has been a debate in medical ethics and medical law on whether it is legitimate for doctors to assist patients wanting to commit suicide in a final state of their disease, where suicide is taken to cover all cases by which a patient intentionally ends his or her life, either actively or by stopping eating and drinking. So anorexia of some sort might count then? That's interesting. Suicide, maybe anorexia doesn't count as a voluntary act, I don't know. Suicide is commonly understood to cover only cases where someone actively ends his or her own life. Just an aside, like Gödel got paranoid when he was old, and he died from not eating because he only would eat food that his wife gave him. So if something happened to her, I forget what, but he just stopped eating because his wife wasn't around to serve him. So he died. It's like, I don't know if that counts as suicide, but it might have been some other medical problem. Yeah. Where a patient voluntarily stops eating and drinking with the intention to hasten his or her death, that's VSDE, counts as cases of suicide, it is controversial. In the following, we presuppose without further argument that VSDE should count as passive suicide. Among medical doctors, the majority view is that these two types of cases, aiding active suicide versus aiding passive suicide, differ radically in normative status. The first type of assistance is considered illegitimate, the second legitimate. But are these judgments compatible? Or is there among judgments some German thingy, a valuational inconsistency? First, 3 remarks about terminology used in the following. Rational suicide will refer to a suicide committed under 4 individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions. 1. The patient is suffering from a condition that is unbearable from his or her point of view and is with high probability irreversible. 2. Relevant palliative treatments are either unavailable or rejected by the patient. 3. The patient consistently and over a long period of time expresses the wish to end his or her life. 4. The patient is fully competent and his or her wish is voluntary and free from pressure or manipulation of others. This definition is tailored to the present context. There may be other constellations under which a suicide might be classified as rational. 2. As stated above, I will assume that allowing oneself to die is a form of suicide even when it does not involve actively killing oneself. This use deviates from how the concept is commonly understood. It is, however, in conformity both with the definition given by classical authors on suicide such as Schopenhauer and Durkheim, and with the official definition of the WHO, like the World Health Organization. It is in conformity, moreover, with the way the expression is commonly used by lawyers. However, subsuming the passive variant under the concept of suicide along with the active variant must not be taken to prejudge their normative status. 3. In talking about allowing oneself to die, the term allowing again will be used as a technical term, implying inaction in relation to the event in question. This is partly in contrast to common usage, according to which allowing can under certain circumstances take the form of action, such as actions of the type removing barriers. Yeah, so like if you open the door, you're allowing someone to go through, but that's not what they're talking about. The discrepancy in the normative judgments on actively assisting a rational suicide and passively letting a rational suicide, in the aforementioned sense, take its course can be illustrated by 3 examples from regulations presently in force in Germany. In criminal law, it is widely accepted and recently been confirmed by a judgment of the Supreme Court, the BGH, that a doctor is not required to resuscitate a patient whom he or she knows to have committed rational suicide in the above sense. The same view was taken as earlier as in 1986 in the some more German words I can't read, drawn up by a group of lawyers and physicians On the other hand, new prohibitions penalizing suicide assistance under certain conditions had been added in 2015 to the criminal code. Furthermore, the legal definition of suicide assistance in the relevant law is remarkably inclusive. It prohibits not only providing lethal chemical, but also giving pertinent information and advice, or giving a patient an opportunity to commit suicide by providing an appropriate room. I'm sorry about my inability to speak other languages. One of my deficiencies. In the medical code, an explicit prohibition of assisting suicide was introduced in 2011, which, however, is standardly interpreted as prohibiting aiding rational suicide only in its active form. Interestingly, this prohibition has been accepted by a majority, but not all, executive medical bodies in Germany, with the result that a physician in one city is under the risk of being sanctioned by his or her chamber of physicians, whereas a physician in a neighboring city is not, if these happen to belong to the jurisdiction of different chambers. The discrepancy in attitudes to assistance in active suicide and tolerating suicide in the passive form of VSED is well documented in a recent statement of the German Society of Palliative Medicine on VSED. The German Society of Palliative Medicine supports the prohibition expressed in the medical code of a cooperation of doctors in suicide as far as this concerns the prohibition of prescribing substances with the aim of committing suicide, as well as the prohibition of giving concrete advice in the planning of suicide. Voluntary stopping eating and drinking can be alternative for some patients. To end life in this way, with the possibility of interrupting or abandoning the project at any time, enables these patients to live and die in a self-determined way. Okay. This statement seems provoked by the growing interest of elderly people in VSED, triggered by the legal restrictions on physicians-assisted active suicide. Interestingly, it seems to be based on the premise that cooperation of doctors in suicide, where suicide is understood as active suicide, is necessarily itself active, whereas a cooperation of doctors with a patient who voluntarily stops eating and drinking, thereby committing suicide in a passive way, is itself passive. The underlying view seems to be that physicians and carers must not be actively involved in initiating the suicidal process and indirectly in the patient's death. They are allowed, however, to be tolerant in cases of rational suicide, of an initiative on the side of the patient to end his or her life, either actively or by stopping taking in fluid, as long as this does not involve actively supporting the patient's decision to start the process nor its execution. The only exception is, in the case of VSED, the permission to accompany the process once it has been autonomously started by the patient. Okay, that's, it's a little odd sometimes. It's like I can't tell you to do something, but if you were to go through that door, and believe me, I can't tell you to do that, then after you go through that door, then I can help you out. But it's like one of these, I can't help you and I can't say anything about it, but if you go over there and do that thing, then I can help you. But I can't say that. A lot of double speak here. However, if this is the underlying view, it is based on, I don't mean to be making fun of them, but it just seems a little ad hoc. But I mean, that's why this paper got written, because it needs to get figured out. However, if this is the underlying view, it is based on a problematic assumption. The correlation between the descriptive dimensions and dimensions active and passive, and the normative dimensions permissible and impermissible, cannot be made as perfect as may seem desirable. Not even close, people. Never can. The physician tolerating an active VSED is not only passively involved in the process. Typically, the patient will not start the process without the physician's assurance that he or she will help him or her in a potential crisis during the process. In the cases reported in Chabot's study of a series of Dutch cases, a physician or palliative care team was not only involved in the process, but also involved in the decision to start the process. Chabot strongly recommends this kind of involvement in order to assure the patient and family carers of professional support if the necessity arises. Yeah, because this is sort of the old putting your sticking your head in the ground theory of things, which it always seems like a good idea at the beginning. That's kind of how it's like, all right, you can do the thing, but we're just going to ignore you for now, and that always seems to be people's first reaction. I wonder why that is. I just don't know. Now, if anybody in the audience has any questions, please feel free to ask. Just write in the chat box. I'll hopefully see it. Sometimes when I'm reading one thing, I don't see the other thing. I have to get better at that. Okay, though giving this assurance is not strictly a causal necessary condition of the patient's decision to start the process, it is typically one of the factors on which this decision depends. Of the cases described in a recent collection of cases, there are only a few in which no physician or palliative care team was involved from the start. On the other hand, assuring patient and family of accompanying the patient if the need arises is a positive act and not merely an act of allowing. The same kind of positive act occurs whenever a hospice or some other institution explicitly or implicitly provides patients who declare that they will hasten their death by VSED with an opportunity to do so. This offer, not unusual in practice, is again in many cases a necessary condition of the execution of those patients' wishes. Without the care offered by the hospice, they would not be able to stick to their project, especially if there is nobody else available to care for them during the process. The reluctance to acknowledge this incompatibility on the part of officials has an obvious motive: to maintain against appearances a strict separation between cases on which, on the one hand, a patient is supported in allowing him or herself to die, either from his or her medical condition, from withholding or withdrawing treatment of this condition, or from passively hastening death, which are held to be ethically acceptable, and supporting, on the other hand, the patient in actively ending his or her life, which is held to be ethically unacceptable. Yeah, this is getting to the politics right here. It's like, oh, what did you actually do? It's like this sort of thing a politician might say. I mean, also a lawyer, but like, there's not much different a lot of times between lawyers and politicians. At least not here in the U.S. I don't know how it is in Germany, but for some reason I suspect there's still some overlap. Okay, causal roles. The normative distinction between allowing and supporting someone to end his or her life passively and supporting someone to end his or her life actively seems to be deeply engraved in the moral consciousness of physicians and indeed in general morality. Why does the difference between actions of different types but with identical outcomes, the death of the patient, assume such a striking moral importance? I mean, my first reaction is that, it's a lot of work to become a doctor. You don't want your and the reasons you become doctors are varied, but I don't think it's because you have to put all this time and effort in. You don't want it to be seen that you're doing things you weren't expecting to do if you put all this effort in. It's like it's getting subverted somehow. That's my first. I mean, if I had to guess, because I don't know. The point is that first comes to mind is thinking about potential justifications is the difference in causal roles. On the mistaken assumption that in the case of VSED, the attending physician is not actively involved in the process leading to the patient's death, one might reason as follows. As long as there is 1, no positive act of supporting the patient ending his or her life on the part of the physicians and other caregivers, and 2, the act of allowing the patient to die does not constitute an act of actively withdrawing treatment, it might seem that the act of allowing cannot be classified as a causal contribution to hastening the patient's death. This seems to be the case especially when the most salient causal factors are the patient's medical condition and the patient's mentality. On the part of the patient, the same reasoning leads to the conclusion that even the patient is not causally involved in the process leading to his or her death. There is, in VSED, no positive act by which the patient hastens death in the way it is done in a case of active suicide. After all, the case is not one of self-killing, but of letting him or herself die. Can one say that the allowing on the part of the physician or on the part of the patient contributes to the death of the patient? Can there be such a thing as a purely negative causal factor? This issue has been controversial for a long time in philosophy as well as in law, and will probably continue to do so. Causality is an abstract concept with a large variety of functions, and we need intuitive props to give it a concrete meaning. Unfortunately, there is more than one intuitive prop that lends itself to this task, and which of these is preferred depends to a great extent on professional background. Scientists typically favor what has been called productivity view of causality. One variant of this is the requirement that there must be a flow of energy from the causal factor to the effect, or if not flow of energy, the transference of some other physical magnitude. Obviously, this view is incompatible with the including purely negative factors into the causal set. Lawyers typically replace negative causal factors such as involving in allowing certain processes to take their course by counterfactual constructions, often termed quasi-causality, denying them causal function without denying responsibility. Thus, in the case of a patient committing suicide actively or passively, the physician's behavior in allowing the patient to die would not be held as a causal factor of the patient's death. However, the physician could nevertheless be held partly responsible for it, given that an intervention on his or her part would probably, with certainty, have prevented either the suicide attempt or its result, thereby postponing the patient's death. In the case of the patient committing passive suicide, the patient, though not actively involved in it, might nevertheless be held responsible for his or her death. Though on this view there is no causality in the strict sense between stopping eating and drinking and death, there might still be quasi-causality, which is sufficient for the attribution of responsibility. Okay, so they just gerrymandered the terminology and said, well, we're going to call this some other kind of causality that's kind of like it, but it fixes it. I mean, that's another thing people do when they don't know what else to do. They just make up a like a term or term star, and that's how they fix the problem. They're like, it's not causality, it's quasi-causality, or causality star, or causality 2. I see this all over the place in philosophy. The background of this interpretation is, again, a productivity view of causality, though in this case transposed by a hypothetical level. Had the physician positively intervened, this would have produced a different result from what had actually came about. Had the physician taken food and fluid, he or she would not have died earlier than by natural factors. Another intuitive pathway to the abstract concept of causality is one that does not link genuine causation to the productivity or agency, but conceives of causality as the relation between a certain constellation of conditions and an ensuing event. This alternative picture partly derives from John Stuart Mill. According to this view, causation is a relationship of difference-making where effects result from certain constellations of temporally prior conditions without necessarily being produced by them. In this context, difference-making serves as an abstract concept that can be spelled out in various ways on the model of Humean regularity, by nomological modeling, difference-making by causal laws, by a contrafactual model, on an interventionist model taking its lead from human interventions in the course of nature. Though on these views, negative items such as omissions and absences cannot produce anything, they may nevertheless enter into difference-making relationships with subsequent events by combining with positive factors to form sets of conditions causally sufficient for their events. Logically, they are on par with positive causes and fit Mackey's INUS model of causation. Likewise, positive causes, they are rarely sufficient and rarely necessary for their effects. Like positive causes, they are causes only in the sense of causal factors. Okay, so people have people's opinions differ on causality. I'm trying to remember if I have any firm opinions on this. I think I do, but I can't think of them right now. If causes are conceived of as sets of conditions rather than producers of their effects, this requires a certain shift in our common sense view of causal relationships. According to the common sense view, negative conditions explain certain states of affairs but do not generally cause them alongside their positive counterparts. However, this shift is not as radical as it might seem at first. For one, causes interpreted as conditions are no less able to fulfill most of the functions of causality in our worldview than the productivity view. 1. Causality may still play the role of cement of the universe. It may still be thought of as the glue of the world, with the only difference that the glue is not made of productivity or transference, but of difference-making. In epistemic respects, causality still serves as a concept for use in explanation and prognosis. This function is not impaired by the fact that the conception of causation as productive process is replaced by a conception of difference-making. On the contrary, by allowing for negative causal factors along with the positive ones, the condition view conforms better with the common explanatory practices than its rivals. 3. The justificatory role of causal relations in the attribution of moral and legal responsibility is in no way diminished by conceptualizing causation along the lines of the condition view. On the contrary, it seems better suited to explain the practice of ascribing responsibility for omissions and for negligence than other approaches. There are further reasons for adopting a condition view of causality. One is adequacy. A condition view leaves room for a myriad of ways speech we commonly use to express that something is a consequence of something without prejudicing whether that something is a positive or negative. Consequence is the most frequently used term for cause-effect relations with negative causal factors such as omissions and absences. just because grounding has had I've read so many of those papers, and it gets talked about so much in the recent philosophical literature. Grounding is very related to these things. Like, how do you explain things without giving a causal structure? A lot of times in metaphysics, that's what grounding is doing. So you could say, like, it's a very similar sort of story. It gets told about grounding, and just happened to read a paper on grounding this morning. I've read more in the past. Like, that paper referenced a paper I read earlier 2 months ago. And so it's like, this is a hot topic at the moment, the non-causal descriptions of things. So, there are others which are even closer to expression, carrying connotations of agency and productivity, especially if it is understood that the negative condition is an intentional act. An example is intentional enabling, as used in the context where A enables B to attain something B would not attain unless A intentionally holds back from attaining it. So if I let you win, I guess. A relevant example are competitive activities like applying for a position which A will probably obtain if he or she applies for it, but deliberately leaves room for someone who A thinks is the more appropriate candidate. In this case, A's inaction might be said to be productive by enabling B to start a career. The factor of intention here makes it intuitively easier to see A's inaction as a genuine act and not merely a boundary condition, especially if A's inaction is the crucial condition on which B's opportunity depends. Yeah, I mean, in some sense, why would that inaction? It's like, well, in some sense, you have to say, well, what's the disposition of the person to either act or not act? And maybe this is more of the counterfactual thing ahead of time, but I sort of, this is what I was saying earlier. The people are going to be primed to do something, inclined to act in certain ways. And I think the suicide topic goes against how people are sort of inclined to act to begin with. And I don't know if that's talked about, the agency specific to that community of people here. So I mean, I might have a different intuition as per usual. All my intuitions are different from everyone else at this point, but like, I think I would ask, actually, is there something about medical training and the people that go into medicine that actually make a difference to the opinions and why things are written this way? Same with lawyers. I mean, there might be like differences between doctors and lawyers. I'm sure there are, but like, why exactly, and the different sorts of training that they get might actually have something to do with it. I mean, are they indoctrinated? Not just intuition as doctrine, but are they indoctrinated in certain ways? I mean, what's the Hippocratic Oath have to say about this exactly? So, I mean, that's just a side factor here. Like, maybe there is something individually unique about the communities that is at work. Okay, the intuitionist doctrine of doing and allowing. Causality then does not do the job of explaining or even justifying the normative distinction between doing and allowing, or positive and negative acts. The distinction, however, is one of the pillars of common morality as well as criminal law. See, this is exactly where I'm taking issue. One of the pillars of common morality. I'm not so sure that it's one pillar. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with this statement. I'm just saying the pillars of common morality and criminal law may not be exactly the same to different groups of people, and there may be something to do with that in terms of enculturation and indoctrination. Okay. In the case of harms and wrongs, obligations do not do something that are commonly easier to justify and fulfill than obligations not to allow. Hence, permissions to allow are easier to justify than permissions to do. In the case of benefits or goods, obligations are to allow are easier to justify than obligations to do. Permissions not to do are easier to justify than permissions not to allow. The most well-known example of the first gradient is a normative distinction commonly made between killing and let die. Quoting Michael Moore, "I have a strong negative duty not to kill you even though you are a stranger to me. I have a considerably less stringent duty to prevent your death when compared to my duty not to cause your death." That this distinction is indeed one of the constants of human morality has been confirmed in an international internet survey by Mark Hauser, who found that the doing-allowing distinction was one of the central factors in the spontaneous reactions to dilemma cases with identical consequences but different agental patterns, such as the well-known trolley cases, ultimately going back to the lawyer English? Okay. Other central factors were intentionality and instrumentalizing by using a person as a means for benefit of others. Some of these factors may even be hardwired in the human brain. Maybe. I don't know. I mean, trolley cases are fun. And they're funky, too. Just to think about. It's a very weird situation. This is why I've lost all my intuitions. You think about weird thought experiments enough and I've just lost everything. I'm sorry. Criminal law follows the trend of common morality in sanctioning the act of doing of legal wrong more severely than allowing of legal wrong. According to Section 13 of the German Penal Code, for example, legal responsibility for negative acts is restricted to cases in which there exists prior contractual relationship between agent and affected party, in which the agent stands in some form of close relation to the victim. Even then, it makes room for a mitigated punishment. I mean, same thing here in the U.S. I suppose it's the same way in most places. If the distinct causal roles of doing and allowing are not suited to serve as a basis of the distinction commonly made between their normative status, what else can justify this distinction? One way is to introduce it as a self-evident moral institution in the framework of a deontological ethical theory. Ethical deontologists have less problems with justifying axioms of common sense morality than have consequentialists. They may resort to the strategy to embed the axiom in their theory by postulating it as a prima facie principle and explaining its inclusion by the overwhelming evidence of moral intuition. For consequentialists, on the other hand, this intuition is one of the most stubborn stumbling blocks for their doctrine, and one frequently quoted for reasons for rejecting it. Yeah, sure, but there's more than one way to do everything, so you can do it in consequentialism too. Either way, I mean, the point is fine. Like, if you just want to ingrain this and take it as an assumption, that's fine. And the fact that the Western moral traditions, one works with it better than the other, it's, you don't really have to argue for that. This guy's like, yeah, this can be done. Okay, there are reasons to think, however, that consequentialists should not too readily accept this objection. It seems that they have resources to counter the deontological attack and to integrate the complexity of common sense morality into their outlook. The clue to how this can be done is provided by deontological theories themselves. Far from postulating the acts and omissions doctrine as absolute, they are in general prepared to allow exceptions, mirrored along others in legal norms that sanction wrongdoing by inaction, either intentionally or negligently in special cases. Even Thomas Aquinas, often quoted as the first to propose the doctrine in the Christian part of the world, admitted that the principle of the weakening of responsibility for negative acts holds only in his terminology simplicator et absolute, that is, prima facie, and can be suspended in individual cases. But on what grounds? This is the crucial question. Is the deontologist able to give reasons for why his prima facie principle loses its force in particular cases? Yeah, I'm a little... sometimes you have to write a segue in papers, and that's kind of what this whole section is. I don't think this is really doing a whole lot of work for their argument. I mean, it's just a bit of a hand wave at the Western traditional, morals. So, I mean, this is just trying to get through this bit. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there will be more towards these theories in the future, like in the later paper, but I'm a little... at the moment confused as to the argumentative strategy here. It's like, okay, this is the Western tradition, but what are they adding to the argument about the point here? Alright, so let's see. At this point, the consequentialist is in a clearly better position. Instead of postulating with reference to widely shared intuitions, auxiliary principles to explain exceptional constellations within the doctrine of acts and omissions, or other prima facie principles to relativize the doctrine, the consequentialist can refer to something more objective, namely the potential consequences of making a certain principle a rule of social morality. This, at least, is the strategy an adherent of the multi-level scheme of morality proposed by Richard Hare would follow. It is clear that this strategy of justification reaches further back in history to consequentialist thinkers such as Bentham Mill, who treat morality not as an abstract system but as a social tool, indeed the most central of all social tools, and in consequence, though thought it appropriate to subject it in the first place to our criteria of social efficiency. Okay, so let's see where we're going. Hidden parameters. If there is a moral difference between acts with the same consequences merely by the fact that one act is of doing, whereas the other of allowing. The differences, according to consequentialism, can only be based on a certain specific characteristics or circumstances of the respective form of acting. Are there such specific characteristics or circumstances? I mean, it wouldn't just be consequentialism. You'd have to identify something in the ontology just the same. Of course there are, and one that comes to mind first is the energy an agent has to muster to act instead of remaining inactive, or as Bentham called it, keeping at rest. Thomas Aquinas seems to refer to this difference by asserting that it is easier not to harm than to do good, though he misleadingly changes the example in comparing positive and negative acts. He contrasts harming and not doing instead of two instances of the same category, that is, harming by doing and harming by allowing, or else not doing good by allowing and not doing good by doing. Trivially, the consequences of harming, transgressio, are in general worse than the consequences of not doing, omissio, quite independently of the doing and allowing distinction. Thus, there is only an imperfect correlation between harming and doing, and not doing good and allowing. Harm can be done by inaction, and not doing good can be realized by doing. It is evident that, as far as obligations of malfeasance are concerned, I don't normally get to say malfeasance, so unusual word to say out loud. Rules that are require positive acts are in general harder to justify than rules that require abstention from negative acts. This is primarily so because positive acts tend to be more demanding. In general, it is more demanding to prevent harm than to refrain from doing harm. The same holds analogously for obligations to provide benefits. Helping someone is, in general, more demanding than not hurting him. Obligations to do good are, as a rule, more demanding if they imply action rather than inaction. Conversely, in general, it makes more criminal energy to actively harm others than to allow that they are harmed by others or by natural forces. Okay, I just want to look real quick. You see, now that we're doing this, you see, we're already back to the what the physics were saying about the physics and the counterfactual things. That this plays way more into the physics account of causation than it does into deontology or consequentialism. So I'm just in terms of the argumentative structure, I think that sort of it was a little diversion into consequentialism and deontology, but I don't think that's the crux of the argument here. So it's just an interesting thing about the paper is they felt the need to at least talk about that stuff to justify or to situate it within the history, which is a good thing to do, generally speaking, in philosophy papers. But if you situate it, it's good. But it doesn't. I don't see it actually doing a whole lot of work here, which is kind of an interesting thing for an ethics paper. This is more metaphysics than ethics, really. Okay. This difference, however, is not universal, and there are a number of exceptions. In some cases, the gradient of demandingness is reversed. Helping B can be easy for A if B is nearby and the means to help B are readily available. Not hurting B can be difficult for A after having been provoked by B. The demandingness of principles that require positive acts, in contrast to principles that require negative acts, concern all aspects of human action. Bodily action requires physical and mental acts. Mental acts such as attention and will. I don't know what a modicum of attention is needed even to recognize situations in which intervention is required to prevent harm. Strength of will and sometimes courage is needed to take risks by becoming active. Inaction is, as a rule, more comfortable. In many situations, a certain amount of energy is required to overstep the boundaries of one's body and to interfere in the course of things, even if only by word of mouth. One result of studies by bystander intervention, which seek explanations for people's passivity in the face of obvious harm, is that preparedness to actively help in emergency cases is highest if there are no other people around. If there are multiple bystanders, each of them tends to explain his or her own inaction by the thought that there may be others around with a higher competence to help the victim. This thought, however, is easily explained as a kind of self-deceit in defense of inertia. Furthermore, actions are less easy to eliminate from one's highly remembered biography than omissions. In this respect, the expression dirty hands is telling. Only action, not inaction, leaves a stain. Yeah. Another distinguishing factor is opportunity costs. These are, as a rule, higher for action than for omissions. The energy required for action might be expended on other activities, so that doing frequently implies sacrificing doing frequently implies sacrificing opportunities. This fact is even recognized by archetypal opponents of the doctrine of doing and allowing in the consequentialist camp. Bentham, for example, in a footnote to his introduction, gives the impression that he thinks that positive duties of harm prevention should be held to be morally equivalent to negative duties of not doing harm. Even forbearance to act, or the negation of motion, that is, of bodily motion, supposes an act done, where such forbearance is voluntary. It supposes, to wit, an act of the will, which is as much a positive act, as much a motion, as any other act of thinking substance. At the same time, however, Bentham restricts positive duties in proportion to the sacrifice they require by turning down the demands of morality to the level of mere striving. If duty means anything, that is, moral duty, it is your duty at least to abstain from it, harm, and more than that, if it is what lies in your power, it can be done without too great a sacrifice to endeavor to prevent it. There are many cases in which it is more or less evident that the alternatives to allowing would have worse consequences than the alternatives to doing. In the case of the patient starving him or herself to death, the alternative of fulfilling his or her death wish by active suicide might require more energy and willpower, for example, in order to obtain an appropriate substance, or might be experienced as more traumatic by family and friends. Might. I mean, it might not be that bad either. I mean, if the laws were different, you just had to write a prescription, it might be just the same as everything else. So, I mean, that might just be culturally or society-based what actually takes more work. So we might just be inheriting the morality of the past that may no longer exist. Don't know. Part of the consequentialist reply to the deontological challenge of the doctrine of doing and allowing is then the argument of potential over-demandingness. That's kind of funny, because usually it's the consequentialists that are getting hammered on for being over-demanding. I mean, you always have to figure out all the consequences of your actions. I mean, who can do that? The consequentialist is able to justify a differentiation of positive and negative duties to the extent to which the hypothetical equivalence has the tendency to make excessive moral demands. In practice, the equivalence of duties of commission and duties of omission would bear the risk of hypermoralization, that is, to be ultimately self-destructive. If we had to feel responsible for all the things that we could actively change to the better, we would be crushed by this responsibility up to the total incapacitation to act. In the real world, responsibility has to be limited if we want to be sure that it will be accepted and followed. Yeah, see, there's a sort of a reversal of the argument here. It's kind of interesting. Because, yeah, the way I've heard this before is always that the deontologists be like, look, I'm just following the rule, that's all I got to do. The consequentialist, on the other hand, has to do a lot of calculating. So it's usually the deontological one is considered to be less cognitively involved. And that's not my opinion, because I actually don't think either of those make any sense, but this is just the way the argument was told to me. And so it's really interesting, not strange, because it's just very interesting that it's coming out different in this case because of this sort of omission and passivity versus active makes a big difference here. It should be noticed that a consequentialist justification on these lines crucially depends on contingent anthropological facts. In a world of fanatical altruists or activists without interest in inertia and self-sufficiency, allowing would probably be felt as no less or even more demanding than doing. Active harming might count as less of an evil than it does in the real world, and active well-doing as less praiseworthy. Given that moral principles have to be accepted in all possible worlds, imaginary worlds like this are a strong argument against any attempt to attribute the normative differentiation between positive and negative acts with the same expected consequences to features intrinsic to these acts. Besides demandingness, there seems to be another hidden parameter to the doing-allowing distinction that is more relevant to permissions than to obligations. The perceived threat that one might originate from a permission to act rather than a permission to allow. A perceived threat? Really? That's what's going to happen here? Okay. This threat is an important factor, especially if allowing is directed at what seems to be a natural process. Intervening in processes that are seen as natural often meet with a kind of instinctive skepticism that is absent if the same processes are left to the natural course of events. Oh, come on, we're people. We don't have really... We only say that when we want something that's going the way we want it to. Otherwise, it's unnatural and bad. I'm not disagreeing with the author. They're right in what they're saying. I'm just like, people are not that. I don't trust people when they say things like this. This tendency sometimes emerges even if allowing can be expected to have more negative consequences than deliberate intervention. This quasi-instinctive tolerance has been called naturalness bonus. I haven't heard of that before. Its most conspicuous manifestation is the high degree of tolerance of natural risks, even in cases in which these can be prevented by technical means, and the comparatively low degree of tolerance of anthropogenic risks, as, for example, the case of vaccination. The most telling example is, again, human death. An active contribution to determining the point of time at which death occurs is viewed by many people with a kind of basic distrust, even if death is thereby much more peaceful and tolerable for all parties concerned. In contrast, a natural death without intervention continues to be idealized in spite of the evidence that a great number of natural deaths are far from peaceful. Yeah, I think that this is part of the ignorance of people. I once saw some statistics about this. There is almost no chance you're going to have the death you want. There isn't, like, it's very, very small. Like, and that's not even, like, being specific about, like, you having a specific kind of death. That means, like, any sort of good death, it's unlikely. Most people do not, and at least in the last, like, 50 years, or maybe it was like 75, or whenever the data was from, it's very unlikely that you get the nice sort of, like, die in your sleep, happy at home. Very few people do that. Like, it's rare, like, very rare. Like, we're talking 1% rare. So it's not going to be you. It'll be maybe 1 out of 100 people get that sort of thing. So it might just be that, like, people are wildly misinformed or romanticizing their death, which I think is way more likely. And so the idea of this natural death without interference, if they actually knew the numbers, then they would not be so happy with that. Okay, I think it's just general ignorance because people avoid the topic. There is furthermore an analogous asymmetry in the fear of slippery slopes. Permissions to do are more often the object of slippery slope concerns than permissions to allow. A once given permission for a kind of innocuous doing may lead to other kinds of less innocuous doing. Permissions to allow certain processes to proceed are thought to invite slippery slopes. For example, by negligence to a lesser degree. Yeah, maybe. Okay. Consequences for the practical issue under discussion. Okay, getting to the end of this. This is an interesting article, though. It's metaphysics and some history of ethics, and yeah, it's good stuff. There seem to exist then some good consequentialist reasons for a normative differentiating between doings and allowings with the same consequences. The main reason is the tendency of rules requiring the agent to positively act to be more demanding than rules requiring the agent to remain inactive, so that the process independent of the agent is allowed to proceed. Another reason is that doing often has a higher opportunity cost. It prevents agents from doing other desirable things more than allowings do. Two things, however, should be noted. 1. The described tendencies are rooted, at least in part, in contingent anthropological facts and not in the intrinsic nature of doings and allowings as such. Yep, I completely think this is a big deal. That's just how things have been set up, and so that's why things are this way. But that doesn't mean they should stay this way. It's just how they were. 2. This tendency is only an overall tendency and does not lend itself to the derivation of rules or remark concrete nature. Even criminal law, which is under the obligation to make its norms as explicit as possible, cannot do without a certain room of maneuver to adapt its sanctions to specific constellations. There are, for example, cases of allowing harm which seem hardly less criminal than their active counterparts, such as deliberately withholding a life-saving medicine from a patient unable to attain it by his own efforts. Yeah, it's one of the old doctor. Well, if you're in the U.S. and you steal your medication, you get in a lot of trouble, but the medication costs here are insane. It's not like, it's wild. It's like So it's like this sort of thing is in the news, or was in the news quite regularly, but I don't know what insulin costs. I mean, we've got laws as to how much insulin can cost nowadays. It's getting that bad. I mean, insulin has no patent. It was given away by the inventor. Like, it shouldn't cost anything. Anywho, with regard to our initial issue, the normative status regulators ascribe to physicians' assistants in their patients' active and passive suicide. The result of our discussion is that the moral differentiation commonly made between supporting an act of active suicide and an act of passive suicide could only be justified if both types of act differ in one way or another in the dimensions of demandingness or of potential threat to others. It seems, however, that neither of these dimensions is relevant to the case at hand. Demandingness for one cannot be relevant. Demandingness would be a good reason against an obligation of doctors to actively assist a patient to end his or her life under the relevant circumstances. However, this is not the issue. The issue is not the legitimacy of an obligation, but the legitimacy of a permission. Threat, on the other hand, does not seem to be relevant either. There may be some threat to some people in the practice of active euthanasia, as it has become in the someplace countries. But this threat relates to the fact that someone else, the physician, functions as an agent, not the patient. It does not allow the conclusion that the same threat is felt in the context of an action controlled by the patient. The only factor that might be felt as a threat is the factor of irreversibility, which is present in active suicide and absent in its passive form. It is improbable, however, that it will make a difference in the situation of rational suicide as defined above. I'm not even sure that would hold. It would only hold until... It might not even hold until the last very second in both of these. So it might just be a question of time scale at that point. Minor point. Of course, there might be, beyond these dimensions, further morally relevant positive or negative consequences that might support the deontological doctrine of doing and allowing. Thus, two questions have to be asked. Is supporting an act of suicide under the conditions specified potentially more harmful to third parties than supporting the process of VSED? Is supporting an act of suicide under the conditions specified potentially more beneficial to third parties than supporting a process of VSED? So harmful or beneficial to third parties in that question is the question. As to the first, it must be said that rational suicide can indeed cause great harm under the circumstances, especially to family and friends who would prefer the patient to live until life comes to a natural end. This harm has to be borne, however, in both cases alike. On this count, there seem to be no relevant difference between the active form and its passive counterpart. For the family, an act of suicide under the mentioned conditions may come An act of suicide under the mentioned conditions may come as a shock, especially if the patient has not adequately communicated his or her project, but VSED can be a strain on them too. Though there are a number of reports of family members who experienced accompanying their relative as deeply rewarding, partly because it appears not markedly different from a natural death, there are others who find it hard to see the patient gradually decline in physical and mental powers for days or even weeks. The main burden of the method is, however, on the patient, who has to muster up considerable strength of will to suffer the gradual decline and potentially defend his or her resolution against family members urging the patient to stop the process. As to the second question, the group with the most significant relative benefit is the group of physicians whose active involvement in the process tends to be more limited in the case of the passive form than in the case of the active one, and easier to reconcile with the traditional value orientations. However, for the reasons given above, it is by no means nil, and no matter whether VSED is classified as a form of suicide or not, the physician making the process possible contributes in one way or another to the patient's death. It would, however, be question-begging to argue that the higher acceptability of passive over against active suicide under the relevant conditions with the de facto higher acceptance of the passive variant by physicians. Taken all in all, it must be doubted whether the balance of reasons pro and con establishes a clear priority of the passive over the active variant. When it gets to be sort of like this equal thing, a lot of times people just default to what it was, so I'm not sure I like this conclusion here. It's like, I don't know. Sort of worried about just saying, we don't know. It's like throwing up your hands. It's like, well, that happens sometimes. It's fair. Oh well. The same can be said of a number of other widespread objections to the physicians assisting patient suicide in terminal conditions, which apply to both forms and cannot single out the passive form as less objectionable. This is true, for example, of the risk of misjudging the situation of the patient, or fail to see that the suicide project in question is not, after all, rational, but that the suicidal person irrationally deprives him or herself of possibilities of going on living with a satisfactory quality of life. Irrational suicide is in fact harmful, with the harm essentially done to the suicidal person, him or herself. In this way, the majority of suicide is indeed a form of self-harm. This is, however, not the case in the example we've been started from. There are criteria by which rational suicides of the kind our example can be distinguished from more common run of irrational suicides has been convincingly shown by a number of recent studies. My conclusion is that whether suicide is held to be inherently morally problematic, the view of most Catholic moral theologians, or is morally indifferent, the liberal view, there seems to be no moral reason to prefer the passive to the active variant. Neither the deontological acts and omission doctrine nor its consequentialist analog seem to be able to support this preference. Okay, cool. Yeah, so this was a fun paper because I think it did a few things and it did them well. It had some sort of technical jargon, which is always it's just sort of what philosophers do. And this particular version of it went over a few different kinds. It went over legal, medical, and then it also did some physical stuff. So we had a variety of sort of like the way we interpret certain doctrines in under different sort of schemes. So we've got the philosophical ethical schemes. We've got the sort of passive the physical things where the causality literature, and then we've also got the legal interpretation here. So we've got at least three different medical, causality, and ethical. So we've got a few different things going on here, which is interesting. It's hard to put a good paper together when you're doing things like this because you have to have at least some understanding of all these sorts of different discussions. So that's one of the nice things about this paper. Of course, when you survey stuff, you're not doing a whole lot involved with them, and that was kind of my beef with the the gloss of the ethical theories. I mean, I'm not exactly in love with I don't really buy what was going on with the deontological and the consequentialist stuff. It doesn't matter what my opinion is, but I just didn't. It's like I saw it more of as just a way to get their argument across, because I don't think there was nothing in that pushed the argument in one way or the other. It just, as they said at the end, basically it didn't matter where you were coming from, the results were the same. Which is fine. I mean, that's a result in itself, but I don't know how much more it added to the paper doing the history. Let's see, anything else I have to say? Oh yeah, there are some questions about how much the anthropology matters here, and the author did mention it. They brought it up as important. So it's just what exactly is, as I was saying earlier, the indoctrination and sort of the culture of doctors, lawyers, people involved in this, and the society at large, and that may make a big difference in how these things are being shaped. But yeah, I mean, that's what scientific studies are for, so you can figure out sort of what people think. But I mean, that doesn't, as they said, it doesn't in this last little bit. Where was it? Right here. Just because things have been this way, it does not mean it should be that way. So you can't derive rules or a more concrete nature. It just happens to be the way things are now. Okay, so any comments from the audience out there, please let me know. Otherwise, that'll be it for today. Today is Sunday. I usually take Mondays off, so I'll be back probably Tuesday with more papers. And please send me something if you have anything you think it would be fun for me to read. I will give comments. All right. Have a good day. Good night, everybody, and I will be back Tuesday. Stay safe, y'all.